Kenneth, thank you very much for coming to the MSU on this sunny summer day, and I have some questions to you. You studied George Berkeley's philosophy some time ago, and then you've started working on the philosophy of mind. Did Berkeley influence your views on mind?
So there was the kind of general debate or dialectic it runs from Descartes to Hume and maybe Thomas Reid, so including Berkeley, of course, about the nature of, well, really about whether or not we are aware of the mind or consciousness as a substance. That issue, which you find it really clearly in Berkeley and Hume, because Berkeley, of course, argued against material substance, and then you find in Hume kind of arguments against mental or spiritual substances too. And it kind of turns on an issue that's really at the heart, I think, of a lot of debates about the nature of consciousness, which is something like, just what can we know about consciousness from introspection or phenomenological reflection? And for example, can we know what its categorical status is, whether it's a substance or some kind of properties or a process? So that kind of issue I thought somewhat about in reading Berkeley and Hume especially. So Berkeley, of course, thinks minds are the only causes, and he thinks we basically know that the mind is some kind of substance. It's like a substance. He doesn't have the same skepticism about mental substance that he has about material substances. And then Hume, of course, says, well, maybe they're really equally, it's equally reasonable to be skeptical about mental substances too. And I think that's an important issue, and that has fed into certain things I think about phenomenology and what kind of knowledge it can give you about the nature of consciousness. And one other thing I might say, I've been very influenced, or you might think it was somewhat of an influence. I mean, you find in Berkeley the idea that, for example, there could not be pains or ideas without minds, without something perceiving the ideas. So I think some version of that thesis is true. Now in Hume, the argument is something like, yeah, but we don't find this thing that perceives ideas. Like, we don't have an idea of it too. We don't see this, when we introspect, we don't see this sort of other idea that always stands in this relation to these, variable ideas. Actually, both Berkeley and Hume are right. So what you have to say is something like, yes, all appearance in consciousness is the appearance of something, to a mind, to some. But what is an appearance to is not some further idea. It's not some further, something you can isolate, idea in the sense of Berkeley and Hume. It's not some kind of object that you can see that just stands in this relation to things that appear all the time. Well, what is it then? So I have some ideas about that. Really, I think if you say, well, consciousness is self-manifesting, or you have this view that consciousness represents itself in a certain way, you can make sense of both the Berkeleyan intuition and the Humean one. So consciousness is manifest to itself, but that doesn't mean that there's some little thing to which it's all manifest to.
Could you say something about self-representational theories of consciousness?
Okay, so the way I see it, I mean, I've often used representation in the discussion of self-representational theories of consciousness in a wider sense than a lot of people want to use it. So for me, sort of from the beginning of thinking about it, I was open to interpreting representation to mean either what, say, naturalistic theorists of representation mean, or what has now come to be called the phenomenal intentionality program or research I think Uriah Kriegel calls it the phenomenal intentionality research program. Well, that's a notion of representation or intentionality that you find in Brentano and Meinong and Husserl, where the view is that real representation always involves some kind of phenomenally conscious aspect. So from the beginning of my own writing about self-representational theories, I used representational to mean either of those things, and to kind of leave it open what exact theory of representation one had in mind. Now, in most discussions of representational theories of consciousness, of course, they don't mean that. They mean that somehow we give a naturalistic theory of representation. We say what representation is in terms of some relations and states and so on, entities that we find acceptable from a metaphysical or physicalist, materialist or physicalist ontology. And then we say, oh yeah, the conscious states have some extra thing on them. So everybody accepts the idea that, or almost everybody accepts the idea that there are, in some sense, unconscious representational states, and there are conscious ones. And the idea of most representationalist theories is that, oh great, we get a theory of representation that we can all accept, and that's naturalistically acceptable, and then we just say what is special about the conscious ones. Special in the sense of, what's the extra ingredient? And then there are a number of views about that. One view is the so-called first-order representationalist view, where it doesn't have anything to do with higher-order thoughts or a self-directed mental state, but it's just, usually the idea is there's representational states that are poised to interact with behavioral and sort of rational decision-making states. They're sort of ready to interact with those other, what would you call them, modules in your mind or brain, and that they somehow have a non-conceptual content to them. That's how you get this idea that, we have sensory qualities, right? Well, the higher order, people like David Rosenthal in the higher order thought line of thinking about consciousness say, well, it's not enough. You also need some kind of sense of subjectivity. And the higher order thought representationalist type of theory says, higher thought and higher order perception, that you have a second order in the sense that its object is a first order mental state. And then there are hybrid views like, no, it's really just one mental state with a couple of components, one representing the other. To me, those are just terminological variations to try to deal with fundamental objections to the theory. Well, one thought then is, no, it's not that something else is representing the lower order mental state. It's that the mental state represents itself, has this kind of reflexive or loopy structure. Well, from my point of view, that better represents the phenomenology of consciousness, the way the experience actually is, that it's always aware of itself. But it's, from a dialectical point of view, the only advantage of a self-representational theory, where we understand representation in this kind of reductive, naturalistic sense, is that you don't have a so-called targetless higher order thought problem. That's the problem that, well, maybe the lower order mental state doesn't exist. Now you can get around this problem by saying, oh no, they always come together and they're bound together in some way. Okay, that's, in my view, a kind of ad hoc way to get around the problem. The self-representational theory isn't ad hoc in that way because, of course, if something represents itself, then it exists. I mean, anything that can be truly said to represent itself also exists, so you don't have this problem. But you have every other problem. And in particular, if you look at kind of the most popular naturalistic theories of representation, like my favorite one is Ruth Millikan's teleosemantic theory, Well, I mean, there's still sort of fundamental problems with applying this to consciousness. I mean, in particular, it seems to me you can imagine kind of a variation on the swamp man thought experiment. So what makes something like Millikan's very explicit that self-reference or self-representation is possible on her theories. That's not an issue. Sometimes people worry about that being, that's not really a worry. But what is more worrisome is that something has the representational content it does. It represents what it does in virtue of its natural history, basically. And if you had a different natural history, you could represent different things. So one of Millikan's own examples is about a beaver, the beaver's tail splashing in the water, representing the time at which it occurs. So there's a kind of self-reference to it, a kind of token reflexive representational content to it. Well, but you can easily imagine that given a different natural history on the teleosemantic theory, the beaver's tail could have represented all kinds of different things, right? Just happens to have had that history that guarantees that it has that content and not some other. Well, you could say the exact same thing for whatever kind of brain states we have that are the self-representational ones in that sense. So it means if we take an atom for atom replica of you and just give you a different natural history, you just came about by some different way, then you're not conscious, in fact, because this state represents actually something else, not itself. And to me, that seems just crazy. And it's not a sufficient rebuttal to say, oh, well, you know, you're just imagining something that would never be, or is very unlikely, or highly improbable, or something like that. That the very fact that a theory allows for that possibility, it seems to me, is enough to draw it into serious question. So, generally, I reject theories of consciousness that make it dependent on, in the way that the teleosemantic theory would, dependent on states of affairs that are really external to the brain and to its current state. I think it supervenes narrowly on the brain, you know. So I think that what is right about higher order and self-representational theories, and representational now in the narrower sense, meaning theories that employ theories of representation that are reductive and naturalistic. Well, what's right about them is that they're trying to capture the subjective character of experience. It's not like just that there are pains and colors that just appear but appear to no one. This is a way of trying to capture the idea that they appear to someone, that they are part of one's experience. And I think that's absolutely correct. What I am more skeptical about is the idea that self-manifestation, if you want to call it that, the appearance of consciousness to itself, which is encoded in self-representational theories, it's not clear to me that that is best thought of as a kind of representation in the narrower sense of representation. If you want to think of it as phenomenal intentionality and call that representation, then fine. I prefer to think of it as a kind of self-acquaintance or a kind of self-manifestation. And just if you ask, well, then what is acquaintance? Well, it's a relation between consciousness and itself, a relation of what? Manifestation or acquaintance? And then we ask, what is that? I think it's best to say, look, we don't have complete access to its nature. We need an empirical theory to be able to say. So we develop a theory of consciousness that has this reflexive element in it, and there are various strategies, various mathematical models that allow you to try to capture self-representation. There's models based on hypersets or non-well-founded sets. There's models based on mathematical logic and the arithmetization of syntax, kind of out of Douglas Hofstadter and Gödel Escher-Bach. And then there are models that I've been working on with a couple of colleagues of mine, David Rudroff and Daniel Benquin, the mathematician in France, and Gregory Landini in the United States, where we're trying to understand it in terms of higher dimensional projective geometry. So the idea is to develop mathematical models that allow you to capture this reflexive nature of consciousness and then see how those are implemented in the brain. And if it turns out that we don't get any really deeper understanding of self-acquaintance as a relationship, as a relation that we can just extract from the whole structure, the whole sort of setup of consciousness, well, that's fine. My view is that there's really no reason to expect phenomenology to tell us what the nature of manifestation or the acquaintance relation is. And if we want to know more about it, we're going to have to build theories that end up being testable and successful. And to sort of accept this in a spirit of natural piety, as who was it? Samuel Alexander said.
If there were an atomic twin of mine, would he have the same conscious states?
So if it's, my view is that if it's an atom for atom replica of you, it doesn't matter how it came about. It's going to have exactly the same conscious states. And those conscious states will have some representational content. But if it's atom for atom replica of you, it will be exactly the same. So, I don't know, some freak accident in another galaxy puts together you, a copy of you, right? Artyom, intergalactic Artyom, whatever. Not intergalactic, in another galaxy. You're exactly what your brain state is right now, looking at Mgu, right? And I think it would have exactly the same content.
You said a lot about phenomenology, and why phenomenology is an important method for studying consciousness.
So I think that phenomenology is important because it's an attempt, as a discipline really, it's an attempt to get at and to describe accurately the structures, the general structures of conscious experience as they seem to us. And that is an important piece of data. And if we say, there are kind of two extremes. On the one extreme, you could think that phenomenology and phenomenological methods get you some kind of unrevisable data about consciousness, that we're infallible or something like that. I don't think that, and I actually don't think any phenomenologist, not even Husserl himself, thought exactly that we can just by introspecting come up with absolutely infallible judgments that have a great deal of content to them about the general structure of consciousness. If you just read, for example, in the lectures on time consciousness, you can see that this is kind of a struggle, right? It's not like we just say, oh, let me see about this structure of time consciousness. Here's what it is. Like, it takes you 2 seconds or something, and you have an infallible judgment about its structure. No, that's ridiculous. And Husserl himself was well aware of that. Anybody who reads him carefully knows that. He was himself always revising, and he called himself a perpetual beginner and a philosopher of infinite tasks and things like that. So I think, though, what you get, if you look at phenomenology as a body of attempts to describe the structure of consciousness as it appears to us, it's a perfectly not only reasonable and informative task, but it's indispensable for building theories of consciousness. Because what it can give you are some hypotheses about what the structure of consciousness is like. On one extreme, if you said, so there's the sort of extreme of infallibility, and then there's the extreme that it's just forget about all of it. Don't talk about introspection at all, and don't talk about phenomenological data at all, because it's perfectly useless. Right? If you go that route, then you kind of have no clear idea of what the explanandum is for a theory of consciousness, unless you want to say it's just our verbal behavior about It's just what we are inclined to say, or something like that. That seems rather inadequate to me. Why? I guess because at some level I accept the basic idea of the cogito, that I am aware that I exist, and that I'm aware, of my awareness, and that my awareness has certain patterns in it. Now, that's the kind of thing that I think you can't. I mean, there are some interesting attempts to try to defend that idea, and also some interesting skeptical attacks on it. But it's better not to, for kind of practical reasons it's better to say, let's put the debate about that aside exactly. If we want to build a theory of consciousness, you follow whatever your phenomenological muse is, just figure out what you think the structures are, try to describe that as clearly as you possibly can, and then try to figure out what kind of model you can build from that. So in my own ideas about it, it's not just me, there's plenty of people who think along these lines. The idea is to try to extract from phenomenology the general abstract structural patterns that we find that are invariant or seemingly invariant. Even if they turn out not to be invariant, it doesn't really matter as long as they're, say, salient. We extract these salient patterns and we try to turn this into a mathematical model of some sort, some kind of mathematical formal description of consciousness. And then we try to build or construct hypotheses about how something with that structure could be implemented in the brain, how the brain could implement that structure. Now, one assumption here is that there is some kind of identity between consciousness and some sort of brain process. Okay, if not an identity, some kind of structurally isomorphic process. But I think identity is more plausible myself. So once we have this mathematical model and we have some way of seeing how this can be implemented in some brain processes that are in principle understandable by the neurosciences, if we could do that and we could test this model, right, we could have a genuinely scientific theory of consciousness. So it seems to me that phenomenology is important because it gives you a lot of prima facie data about what the structure of consciousness is, and if you don't have any idea about what this structure is, there's no way you can sort of build a bridge from consciousness as you live and experience it to your brain. So there's no clear explanandum without phenomenology. That doesn't mean you have to think it's infallible.
Well, is heart problem a real problem?
Yeah, it's a real problem in the sense that you're right. It's just not clear how it is that consciousness, as you know and love it, as you experience it, as it seems to you, could be a kind of brain process. It's very hard to understand how that could be. Now, I myself think that the problem is actually very closely connected to phenomenology and to what phenomenology does not tell you. And this is related to what I was saying earlier about Berkli and Hume. On my view, it's the fundamental mistake of some phenomenologists, like Sartre, for example, at least Sartre up through Being and Nothingness, was to think that phenomenology gives you access to all of the properties of consciousness. Its categorical properties, whether or not it's a brain process, whether or not it's physical or material in some way, whether or not it's a substance. Sartre was actually pretty rigorously consistent about this. And what he noticed was, so on the downside, what Sartre did was argued things like, well, there couldn't be any influence of unconscious mental processes on consciousness. Why? Because we don't see them, we don't find them. Well, of course we don't find them, right? If they're sort of unconscious, we're not going to find. But for Sartre, no, that means if you don't find it, it's not there. And this was, of course, part of his attempt to save the idea that we're radically free. So we don't have any. It always struck me as strange. You may know that Sartre took mescaline, the drug mescaline, in when was it, 1938, I think, under the supervision of a psychiatrist who was also his classmate at the École Normale Supérieure, if I have to, named Daniel Lagache. And it wasn't uncommon for people in psychiatry to experiment with mescaline because they thought it was what they called psychotomimetic, that it basically puts you in a state that was similar to being psychotic. So Sartre was interested in imagination and hallucination, perceptual illusions. For a number of reasons, he was writing a book about the imagination, above all. And so he took mescaline, hallucinated and so on. It always struck me as strange that somebody who has taken mescaline and knows firsthand how drugs like that totally alter consciousness could think that consciousness is not really part of the causal plexus. It kind of didn't have a causal relationship. It just seems like strange to me how somebody could become convinced of it. So right, you take mescaline or drink alcohol, whatever, you don't notice, there's no awareness of where it is exactly that this chemical is causing strange phenomena. It's just suddenly the strange results happen, right? So you don't have access to how that works. Well, for Sartre, the idea is if you don't have access to it, then it's not really, there's no sort of hidden structure or hidden relationships between consciousness and the physical world, right? And nothing is hidden, basically. So he rejects the idea that consciousness is causally, enmeshed in the world. He rejects the idea of certainly the Freudian unconscious. And why is he, his arguments, if you look, for example, in his little book on the emotions, he's very explicit about it, about rejecting unconscious influences on consciousness, influence of the unconscious. And he argues that basically, well, we don't find it. When we introspect, we don't see it. So it means that he has this assumption that phenomenology delivers all the goods. It gives you everything that you could want to know about consciousness. That it's complete, we could say. So I think that an assumption like that consciousness has no hidden properties and gives over all of its information about itself, that is really at the root of the hard problem in a way. And so the way to address it is to say, well, look, consciousness could be physical, it could be computational, it could be all kinds of things that we simply don't have access to. And since we don't have access to them, they don't figure into our common sense concept of consciousness. So we're going to think that the concept of consciousness varies from, we can imagine consciousness with a body, without a body. We can imagine all kinds of, you don't always have to have a brain, or you can imagine brains without consciousness, right? The zombie thought experiment and so on. Well, to my way of thinking, that just rests on our ignorance about consciousness, and the idea that we're ignorant about it means, or what I'm trying to say is, phenomenology doesn't tell us everything about the metaphysics of consciousness. So once you accept that, then you can say, okay, fine. So our concept of consciousness is quite different from our concepts of the physical world and of the brain. We can't see how they're related in some a priori way. But there's reason to believe, there's a lot of a posteriori evidence that consciousness is some kind of brain process. Well, how can we bridge the gap? How can we make this kind of identification more understandable? And it seems to me the only way to do that is through kind of structural phenomenology and a mathematical theory from that to the brain implementing those structures. Now, if it turns out that's impossible, then I guess I would be a Mysterian, like Colin McGinn, and think that, okay, it's a physical process, but we're simply constitutionally incapable of understanding it. how it could be. I would do that before I would accept panpsychism or dualism or idealism. Although those are fun to think about too. But even though I think that phenomenology doesn't, so I think that the root of the hard problem is really the fact that the concept of consciousness comes from phenomenology, and phenomenology doesn't tell us everything about consciousness. Consequently, we tend to think that if we don't find this information, it doesn't really belong to consciousness. So we don't find neurons and brain processes, so we think, okay, that consciousness doesn't, the concept of it doesn't include that. Well, I think we have to accept that our knowledge about the nature of consciousness can be augmented by science, and we should just accept that and forget about the fact that we can imagine whatever we want. And one might say, well, okay, but could it still be sort of, I think it could be computational, in my view. It could be any number of things. It would be nice if it were computational. And what that would mean is not that we should try to emulate or encode some kind of representationalist theories into a computational structure, but that we should just say, oh, that maybe there is some computational structure that is just identical to consciousness, and we just figure out what that is empirically, and accept that our knowledge of consciousness is kind of limited from the inside. So, and that our knowledge from the inside is limited. Our phenomenological knowledge is limited. So that's in a way of embracing a kind of epistemological solution to the hard problem.